Welcome to the Redeeming Stories podcast, a space where we hold honest conversations about healing, dignity, and the courage it takes to reclaim your story. I'm your host, Julie M. Lane from At Redeem Myself, where we explore what it means to move from survival into alignment with truth and how redemption unfolds when we finally see clearly and cared for well. Today, I'm joined by Charlie V. Williams, a mental health. Today, I'm joined by Charlie Lee Williams, a mental health therapist based in Virginia, who specializes in working with NeuroQueer and gender diverse individuals navigating complex trauma and complex PTSD. Charlie uses they/them pronouns. Charlie's path into this work was shaped by their own experience of struggling to find a therapist who truly understood them. That lived experience now fuels their advocacy for access. Charlie's path into this work was shaped by their own experience of struggling to find a therapist who truly understands them. That lived experience now fuels their advocacy for accessible, affirming mental health care, especially for individuals whose identities are often misunderstood, minimized, or pathologized within traditional systems. In today's conversation, we'll explore what accessible mental health care actually means, how the lack of it affects NeuroQueer and gender diverse communities, and why having a provider who understands your lived experience can be transformative. This conversation is about safety, visibility, and restoring dignity in the healing process. Charlie, welcome.
Hi, good to be here.
Wonderful to have you. Share with us that difficult journey you had in finding an affirming therapist. What was that experience like, and how did it influence the way you practice today?
Sure. I started looking for a therapist when I was 4 years old. My mom put me into therapy. And I was kind of bouncing around therapists all throughout my teenage years, never quite finding who was a good fit. Not really understanding why I hadn't been diagnosed with any sort of neurodivergency. And then with all of my trauma that I had dealt with growing up, I didn't have any of the providers that specialized in trauma. And as I became an adult, I decided for myself I didn't really want to be in therapy for a while. So I took a break and then um, came back around and found the therapist I'm with now. She has been with me for the last 5 years. And she specializes in internal family systems work, EMDR, and she is LGBT affirming and is quite knowledgeable in neurodiversity. In finding her, I was also coming into being able to do my own work as a therapist, and her being my therapist and in practicing my own work for becoming a therapist, I realized that I didn't want to just be a cookie cutter therapist. I wanted to be able to provide services for those that were within the LGBT community and had neurodiversity, because it's really difficult to find a therapist who truly understands and doesn't just have book knowledge, they have lived experience. And so being able to provide those things from somebody who has the lived experience side of things, and we can kind of cut to the chase and not have to have them explain to me what a lot of the terminology means or what they're trying to tell from having to explain what all of the nuances mean, and we can just get to the actual feelings side of things or the processing side of things, meant a lot for what I wanted to do with the time with my clients.
Thank you. That resonates with me. I have a dear friend who I met in first grade, and she and I are still good friends to decades later. Her daughter is also neurodiverse, and she identifies with they pronouns. She struggled for a long time to find a therapist, and they live on the West Coast. So I wasn't really sure, if there's a community that I could even give to my dear friend to help her daughter for that population on the West Coast. Do you know of any?
Where at on the West Coast are they?
In the Portland area.
I have a couple of folks that are within the trans community that I'm connected to. One of my colleagues, Kieran McGonigal, is up in Washington and is licensed in Washington, California, but he has a lot of connections, and I can reach out to him specifically and get some of the therapists that are licensed also that may have some availability.
That would be great. Yeah. We've all heard the phrase here, and you've mentioned it here as well. And I know for me, when I was looking for a therapist, when I was ready to start my healing journey, finding someone who was a female, who was a professional woman, worked with professional women, was really hard to find. So, from your perspective, what does accessible mental health care truly look like?
Accessible healthcare can mean a lot of different things. I think first and foremost, it needs to be accessible in regards to finances. If it is able to take insurance, if it's sliding scale, if there's pro bono work, if there is a way that we can find a way that the client can afford it on doing every other week instead or doing once per month instead. Sometimes we can find a way that they can get therapy and it still be effective, but them be able to afford it and not have to pay quite as much. So there's the accessibility on the finances front. Um, Also, telehealth has made things a lot more accessible. There's folks that are in rural areas that sometimes can't drive in or may not have access to somebody who maybe does EMDR or who does IFS or who is able to do trauma work. And so telehealth often makes it more accessible to be able to access a lot of those things. And then also being able to have access to the proper type of communication skills. So whether it's translators or whether it's using like AAC devices, whether it's being able to communicate through the text box on a telehealth chat, communicating primarily via email in between sessions or whatever you need to do in order to be able to best communicate with the client. A lot of those things come into account. And then on the other side of things, also being able to have a good fit for the client and the therapist to be able to have the rapport that is built. So when it comes to having a LGBT therapist matching with an LGBT client, they may see that as one of their primary things that they need. Or having a trans therapist with a trans client, they may see that as the primary thing that they need. And so oftentimes you'll find clients that are searching out specific criteria for the therapist so that it's more accessible in regards to being able to skip through a lot of those hoops that they may have to match with if it's a cisgender heterosexual woman doing therapists with a transgender black man. There may be a lot more things that they have to hop through to be able to be on the same page. So, those are some of the things.
Yeah, I really do get that. I know for me, for so long, trying to find someone who I felt I could identify with. that was serving just professional women, and not teenagers or individuals who had gone through different trauma or experiences that I had. But when you talk about EMDR, that has been one of my saving graces of my healing journey is doing EMDR. And then dialectic behavior therapy or DBT have been my two tickets to moving forward in my own journey. So yeah, finding that person. And I think too, people think that you're going to walk in the office and you're going to click right away. And I learned, I've got to give it, 3 or 4 visits to see if it's going to work or not. I can't pass judgment on the first visit. Are you finding that similar type of experience?
Yeah, I usually tell clients that we give it about 3 visits, and that's kind of our trial run. I always do a 15-minute consultation with everybody. That's kind of like we're dipping our toes in the water. And we give the chance for me to ask questions from them, and they get to ask questions about me, and we kind of get to see if we gel in that way. And then we do kind of like a trial run, and they get to see if they want to stay with me, and I get to kind of see if things gel on my end too. And then if after the 3 visits, they're like, "I actually don't want to," like, it's fine. But that doesn't mean, like, you're locked in after 3 visits either, like, at any point, you can always say, like, "You know what? It's not working for me anymore," or I actually feel like I'm not wanting to do therapy right now." And you can, like, pause or call it quits or find a different therapist. The whole point of therapy is that it's supposed to work for you. It's supposed to be individualized, and you're paying for a service. And so if the therapist isn't working for you, then find a different therapist.
Exactly. Um, when you talked a bit about how, having that therapist who can identify with you, who may have shared your lived experience. And yet for me, there's this line that you have to be so careful, I would think, for therapists, and that when you identify with your clients, there is a place I would think that that line is drawn where you don't overshare or you don't overconnect. What is that ethical boundary when you're trying to say, hey, I can relate to you, but I can't share anything else?
So we definitely want to watch out for countertransference. So when we have something that makes us feel like, oh my gosh, like I have gone through that and I can empathize, and it's making me feel like I'm you in those shoes. And if we're having those feelings, we want to make sure that we work through our own feelings before we like go back and work with the client. But on the other hand, like, if we're gonna do like any sort of sharing with the client, we want to make sure that we are doing it for the benefit of the client, because we don't want to just share to be sharing. I've definitely had therapists, and I've heard from other people that they've had therapists that the client then becomes the therapist for the therapist. And that is what we're trying to avoid. We're not trying to have the client do the work. We're trying to come in and be able to help the client. So we want to avoid sharing any of like the actual trauma stuff. We can say like, "Oh, I can understand because I've gone through a traumatic event in the past," or "I have CPTSD, I can relate." And keeping it fairly vague, but you don't want to go into details, because you don't want to possibly give secondary trauma to your client or end up having them have to be your therapist in a session. So it's about understanding why you're sharing with the client. Are you trying to have them learn something from what you are sharing? Are you trying to have them be like, "Oh, I'm so glad that you have also gone through this, and I'm not alone." And that can be a really good point, because sometimes that's what the client needs, is to know like they're not the only one that's gone through it. Um, but it's when we're kind of processing through before we share with the client of like, why are we sharing this, and how much do we share?
Agreed. Um, my therapist has shared with me, and we're similar in that we're professional women. We've both raised our children on our own. She's got boys, I have girls. They're both into they're all into adulthood. But one of the things I share in common with her is I am such a cognitive thinker. I learned so long ago to stuff my emotions and not feel things that she often will catch me and say, "Okay, I don't want to know what you're thinking. I want to know what you're, feeling." And she will share a bit about her own journey through therapy on trying to overcome that constant cognitive thought, because that's where I'm most comfortable. How do you help clients shift um, in a new direction when they seem to be falling into a routine that isn't um, best for their mental health?
I think one of the cool things about internal family systems, especially combined with somatic, is that you can't really like cognitive your way out of it because you have to be in your body in order to do it. And so, when I'm working with clients, when we're doing any degree of processing or we're trying to like work our way through things, I'm always doing okay, but what do you feel in your body? And how are you experiencing that like somatically, or how are you experiencing that through images, or are they coming through thoughts? And then we pull those apart and we kind of put it through the IFS filter. Um, and we get to take, okay, you have this cognitive thought, but is it showing up for you in any other ways in your body, through images, through emotions? And we get to kind of dissect it. Um, they, I work with a lot of folks that end up having like the intersection between ADHD and OCD. And so we end up dissecting a lot of like spirals that they end up having with the OCD. And so we end up going backwards and being like, okay, you have the spiral. Where did it begin? And oftentimes, when they have the spirals, we're able to find the triggers and help them mitigate a lot of the triggers. But when they're already in the spirals, they can oftentimes be able to get out of the spirals by redirecting themselves out of the spirals, or by using um, thought stopping techniques, where you recognize that you have the spiral in your head and you're able to go, okay, I have this. And then you redirect to either a new task or you redirect to a new thought. And it's easier said than done a lot of the times. And so we usually just start by noticing and being able to say, okay, I noticed this. Um, but there's a lot of unhealthy coping mechanisms, but you have been doing them for a reason, because they've been helping you not feel or experience what is worse than what the coping mechanism is. And so we want to acknowledge that it's been serving a role. And then we want to be able to help redirect it to a more positive coping mechanism, so that you aren't just left in the dust and you don't have anything to replace it. Because if you are having one thing and we're left in a vacuum, something else is going to come up and replace it. And it's probably going to be another negative coping mechanism. So um, at the end of the day, we really just want to make sure that we take the negative and replace it with a positive.
You sound a bit like my own therapist. Why are you going down that road? Don't go down that road. Let's go the opposite direction. Charlie, for people who have been in therapy and they feel misunderstood, dismissed even, what would you want them to know?
I think it's important to recognize that if you have been dismissed, or you haven't had a therapist who is able to build rapport with you appropriately, it's oftentimes because you haven't found a good fit for you. Um, and it's not anything that you are doing inherently wrong. And so being able to find a therapist that matches with you and gels with you and your personalities align is very important so that you are not going in having to mask and overcompensate in your own session in order to be able to get your voice be heard. You want to be able to go in and be 100% your authentic self with your therapist because your therapist should know you better than anybody else in your life. It should be a place that is just you go in and you are 100% open. And if you have anything that is just burning inside you, your therapist should know before your spouse does. It's a place that you want to make sure that is safe and secure, and you have a secure attachment style with your therapist. If you're having any sort of like anxious attachment or any sort of fear around being in that room or anything else that may be coming up that doesn't feel safe with your therapist, um, it it may be time to go and interview other therapists and see where you would feel safe and secure so that you can find a safe place to be able to do any of the emotional labor that you are wanting to do.
Thank you, Charlie. Is there anything else you would like to share with our listeners today about the work that you do, about encouraging the population? Or any additional thoughts?
I just want to thank you for the time here and also just say that working with those that have complex trauma is one of my favorite things. Um, but it doesn't mean that it isn't hard for both parties involved. Um, it I want to caveat that it should be said that even though working through trauma can be hard, it doesn't mean that if you are working through the trauma and it isn't like the hardest day in session that you've ever had in your life, that you aren't making progress. Um, there is ways to work through trauma without it being like inherently hard and inherently difficult. Um, and also, when you're working through trauma, it's kind of like going on a trampoline while trying to go upstairs. You're gonna fall off and bounce back up, and eventually you'll get to the top. But there's just this little bit where you're falling down the stairs while you're trying to heal, and you're not ever gonna get back down to the bottom because you've made that progress. But you want to make sure that you recognize the progress that you have made along the way because it can often feel very long and tedious. Um, and it it can be kind of grueling if you don't recognize all of the small steps that you make along the way. Um, and also make sure that you have lots of people in your corner that are your support network because the support network does more of the work than the therapist ever will.
Thank you for sharing that. I'm often told I've come so far and it doesn't feel like it. Um, so I do understand that it feels tedious, it's exhausting, and sometimes that I'm just not growing as fast as I would like to. But that reminder, for our listeners, Charlie, is also a reminder for me that I am making progress. So thank you for sharing that. As we close this conversation with Charlie, I'm reminded that healing is not about what happens inside a therapy room. It's about what that room feels safe enough for truth to emerge. And at Redeem Thyself, we speak often about redemption as alignment with truth, but alignment requires safety, and that safety requires care that honors identity, experience, and dignity. Accessible mental health is not a luxury, it's a foundational piece that we should all be able to access. So, when individuals are seen, affirmed, and understood, healing deepens, not because that they are fixed, but because they are finally met with distortion. excuse me, they're finally met without distortion. Charlie, thank you for the work you do and the space you hold for those who have too often been overlooked. Until next time, this is the Redeeming Stories podcast. May you continue seeking space that sees you clearly, honor your story, and support your healing exactly as you are. Until next time, we hope all is well with you. Thank you.